Lucy is setting up. I'll introduce her. She is a university lecturer in psychological and behavioral sciences at Cambridge University. Lucy, the floor is all yours.
Great. Can you hear me and can you see my slide?
Yes to both.
Okay, so I'm going to take possibly a slightly different perspective on things, coming at this from a psychology perspective, and also talk from the perspective of some thinking I've been doing, trying to bring together my two sort of topics, if you like, because I have a lab in psychology where I look at cognition and motivated behavior, particularly focusing on food decision making and obesity, but I also work within the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, looking at AI, and particularly in the Animal AI Olympics, linked with Matt Crosby, who you heard from this morning, and trying to bring together these two quite disparate topics gets me focused on the idea of incentives and the embodiment of incentives. So within psychology, we talk about different kinds of motivations, and when we want to model motivation, we need multiple types. So traditionally, we've quite often talked about liking versus wanting. Liking is how much you like something, how much something has inherent value to you, whereas wanting is more like how much it motivates behavior. In the human body or in biological systems, these are generally mediated by kind of opioids and dopamine respectively. But I also want to focus on something that's not always talked about quite so much, which is needing. That is how much your physical body requires something at this given moment in time. And this is generally communicated via hormones, among other things. So these three systems overlap substantially. They're not redundant, and they play different roles. They influence one another, but they each have their own role within decision-making cascades. Liking and wanting can be, and often are, modeled as kind of purely psychological. But needing is an inherently embodied thing. It's linked to having a body with requirements. And so when we're trying to model within AI systems, reward, incentive, motivation systems, quite often we're doing so with only a concept of wanting or liking, or often both conflated. And this actually loses quite a lot of the subtlety and complexity that impacts learning in biological systems, and may therefore limit the kinds of cognition we can produce. So just to give a quick overview of what these different systems are, we can think of liking, how much you like something, as a signal of timeless absolute value. So in a human biological body, for example, you might think of something like a chocolate cake as having very high absolute value. It is highly rewarding. It consists almost entirely of elements that normally signal reward, such as sweet flavor, rich flavor. It is also, very good fuel. It has sugar for energy, as fat for storage. Something like a Brussels sprout for a lot of us would be something that would have low absolute value. It has got a mix of stimuli that are associated with reward, like sweetness, and those that are generally associated with punishment, that is bitter flavor. It's got some fuel value, some energy value, not brilliant, some vitamins, quite good. And then something like quinine would be something that would have very low absolute value. It's actively aversive, it's bitter, and it doesn't really have good fuel value. That is not to say that it has not got good medicinal value, but that's generally not something we represent. These things are irrespective of our current motivational or need state. Wanting, on the other hand, is a signal of drive. It is the reinforcement value of a current behavior, and it is subject to sensory specific satiation. That is getting bored or habituated to something. If I eat a lot of chocolate cake, I want that chocolate cake less, but I like it just as much. Wanting is very similar to, but different to, needing. Needing is a signal of current bodily requirement. It is the immediate requirement to maintain system function. Normally that is something to do with the fuel state, so hunger, or some kind of bodily maintenance, so signals such as pain, or other signals that require immediate attention to the system that you're functioning within, to the embodied system. So I normally study these things within the context of hunger, and to give you an indication of how complex even just the fuel system is within the human body, we can think of the different types of internal signals that help our brains to understand the current need state of our body. Complex systems have complex needs, and these result in complex signals. So the digestive system is regulated by a host of hormones and peptides that interact with the function of the hypothalamus in the brain to modulate eating behavior. So some of them, for example, signal capacity, will more fuel fit in this body, things like stomach distension, or ghrelin, which is released when stomach is empty. There's some signals of long-term storage situation, that is in the human body fat reserves, such as leptin, current energy states, i.e. blood sugar, insulin, or detecting specific needed components of the fuel, such as protein content, those things like CCK. And all of these different things are coming into the central system to try and manipulate whether or not we want and seek food. So different motivators, as I've hinted at, are subject to different influences. Wants and needs are subject to habituation. You can get full, you can get bored. Likes and wants are specific, individual and learned, but needs are universal, or at least within a species or a particular type of agent, and fundamental. A chocolate cake, if you come across a chocolate cake whilst hungry, it is wanted, it is liked, and it is to some extent needed. It contains things that are currently needed, fats and sugars and so forth. It's not specifically needed, any food would do. Then imagine you eat a lot of chocolate, like this very lucky baby. Afterwards, that chocolate cake is no longer wanted. You don't want any more chocolate, but it is still liked. If someone was to say, do you like chocolate cake? You'd say, yeah, I love chocolate cake. I just don't want any right now. And it is no longer containing of things that are needed. This and other factors mean that these things can be, despite the fact that they influence one another, they can act separately. I might want lovely, attractive shoes, but I don't need them. After I've eaten a whole lot of something I like, I might still like it, but I don't want it anymore. Something that is good for me, but unpleasant, so a bitter pill to swallow, quite literally, is something I need, but don't like. Whereas, particularly in the case of addiction, you quite often get the situation where someone really wants something, but they don't actually like it anymore. Similarly, these things actually do influence one another. It's been shown in both rats and humans that long periods without in a food-deprived state change how palatable something seems, how much you like it, how enjoyable it is. Whereas on the same time, blocking palatability with opioid antagonists also changes perceived levels of hunger. So these things aren't completely separate, but they do have their own roles. Why does this matter for AI? Well, as we've seen in earlier talks, incentives and motivations are key to making sure AI does what we want it to do. If you get the incentives wrong, it doesn't matter how smart the agent is, they won't do what you want them to do. So I've been thinking a lot about how we make sure that we've got the right incentive structures and the right motivational systems to make AI work as we want it to. And that's one of the things we've been looking at within the Animal AI Olympics. So
Lucy, I'm sorry to interrupt. Before you move on to this slide, would you mind just moving your microphone a small amount? We're just getting a little bit of auditory feedback.
Is that better?
A little bit closer.
That better?
Much better. Thank you.
No problem. So this setup was, as Matt talked about this morning, an example of minimal embodiment. It's kind of embodied, kind of not, but it does have some elements of embodiedness. One of the points here is that that the agents were trained to survive in a complex environment. They had needs. They had to find food and avoid pain. The cognitive tasks were tests we gave them at the end, but they weren't part of the training. So as with biological systems, cognition was something that we were hoping would be an emergent property of living and surviving in an embodied life, semi-embodied life, but not the target of the training itself. The idea was that you design AI to survive in the world before you give it a job to do. This, however, of course, is only a simulated need, and it's only one motivational system. Does that limit the cognition that can emerge? Well, there's a lot of arguments that it would. Motivation drives behavior, and cognition allows behavior to fulfill a given motivation. Complex motivational systems require complex cognition, but probably vice versa. For example, if you want a system to be able to plan, it needs to not just think when it sees something it likes, do I need it? But then, do I like it? And then that can tell you whether or not to consume it. However, if you have the ability to say, well, no, I don't need it, and I do like it, so what should I do with it? That provides the motivational structure to say, well, one thing I could do is save it for later. You also have to have separate habituation processes within these systems. If you don't want a system that just saves things forever, you probably want the action of getting something, even if you don't consume it, to be able to habituate on its own. And that's something we see in food storing animals. There's also the idea of agency. In this paper, Bellmeister cites Steven Pinker from 1997, who argues that robots don't need, so they cannot want, so they cannot have to be said to have free will, even if they are super smart. Arguably, wants are a central tenet of reinforcement learning. They're the incentive structure that drives reward behavior. But what about needs? Pinker says, what would they want? More floppy disks, which beautifully dates the quote. But actually, you know, I think I was actually, whilst trying to entertain my children this morning during the talks, I was playing them the film WALL-E. And I think this is a really good example of what the point of needs are. WALL-E was able to survive in the world after the humans had gone because not only was he motivated to do his core function, which was to find and crush junk, but also to maintain himself. He needed the ability to perceive, to recognize his own internal, the things that keep him going, to perceive the state of those elements, some sort of interoception, as well as to be able to seek and consume the elements that he needed to keep that going. These can be simulated, these kinds of needs, within something like the animal AI. But you could also think about even non-embodied AI could be thought of being embodied if it were able to sense and seek the things that keep itself alive. For example, the power requirements of its own servers. So this kind of agency, the ability to survive without humans coming and looking after you, requires need that is separate to the other incentive drives. So why does AI need? Well, some cognitive capacities might rely on a multifaceted motivational system that includes an embodied element. It also doesn't matter theoretically how clever AI gets. If it doesn't have an embodied motivational system and the means to fulfill it, then it will never move beyond being a tool towards being an agent. Whether or not we want it to is a different question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy.